do you extend grace to people who know they're damaged, know they've fallen short, and have tried everything they can do morally, religiously to correct it and can't? And so they are hungry for relief of a savior who really genuinely loves and cares for them and who looks at them with truth and grace. Hi, my name is Sam Wheatley. I am the Director of Digital Services for AvailNYC. Avail is an in-person and online platform for people facing difficult decisions, specifically around pregnancy, past abortion, and relationship difficulties. And so I manage the digital department, which includes marketing, content development, and IT support. And this is my Faithly story.
How did you get involved with Avail?
So I've been involved with Avail since its very founding because my wife was one of the original founding board members of Avail back in the early 90s. We were here in New York at a church plant at the time that grew called Redeemer Presbyterian with Tim Keller. And Tim was being pressured at that point to talk about the issue of abortion. And so instead of talking about abortion, Tim, in his creative way, began to talk about what he called the doctrine of carefulness. And he showed throughout Scripture how God treated life with care at every stage. And so whether that is life in the womb, the life of those that are disabled, the life of those at the end of life care, at every point, God treats people with carefulness, and he also calls us as his church to treat people with carefulness. And so we had a situation at the church with a couple who were unexpectedly pregnant. They went ahead and had abortion without talking to anybody, and they started having problems afterwards. And so they came to the diaconate and started asking questions about what do we do? Where do we go? And I just asked my wife if she would research and find some answers of places we could refer these folks to. And she and a group of friends started looking and realized there was not really any resources then for somebody in that situation. And especially somebody wanting a grace-filled way to process and move towards wholeness. And so, in the early 90s, about 7 women founded what was then called the Midtown Pregnancy Support Center, which then became Avail in the 2000s. And so, we've been involved as a family with Avail. As my wife was a founder, we've been supporters the whole year. And then about 2 years ago, I came on to lead the development of a digital product that Avail was producing called Better Clarity. And Better Clarity was a self-guided online platform for people facing these issues, because our research had told us that people were looking online, not wanting to talk face-to-face to people about these sort of intimate issues, and instead wanted the anonymity of the online experience to be able to process. And so we took our model of care, developed a strategy for how to model that on a platform. And I came on, to help build that project and then launch it, which we did this past spring. And now 6 months in, we're seeing pretty incredible results with it.
What is that digital product, and how's that different than the in-person?
So the in-person, actually, since COVID, in-person means on Zoom like this. 90% of our appointments are on Zoom for the convenience and also the anonymity. Somebody can blank their screen, because what we've seen is like the whole dealing with these kind of issues is a journey of trust and building trust. And it takes time for that trust to be developed. So our digital product recognized we needed to build trust from the get-go. And so people were distrustful. Also in this space, people were feeling extremely cross-pressured, that a lot of folks both on both sides of the political spectrum were pressuring people to make hasty decisions rather than wise, thoughtful decisions that were in line with people's own core values and their own future desires. And so, really, our whole emphasis was in creating a digital platform to build trust, help people slow down, and to provide them with the tools that they needed to process and make wise decisions. And so, I think your original question, Danny, was like, how do we do that? So we have sort of short sessions. So a session is like 4 or 5 tiles that deal with one specific issue. And
What
so
do you mean
it's
tiles?
well, it's almost like a carousel, like a carousel where you'd flip through online. These tiles are maybe a specific question or a prompt or something for somebody to think through,
Gotcha.
but it's one discrete topic that somebody's processing through in that. It's not the whole project. It's just one little piece. And so, like for decision making, one of the sessions might be something like, how do I just breathe? How do I slow down my racing thoughts? And so there might be 5 simple ways to begin to slow down your racing thoughts. Then the next tile that would be prompted, or the next session that would be prompted, would follow up on that. How do I identify what I'm feeling? What are the emotions that I'm having? How do I recognize those? And it can be through several different ways. It's not always just journaling's one, but there's also image selection. So there's different types of images that somebody might select. Oh, this image seems to jive with what I'm feeling or processing, and then they're able to explore that and clarify, like on a emotions wheel, what that feeling exactly is. And then the next session would prompt them, okay, well, how do you process, feelings of loss or feelings of anxiety? And so it's guided, sort of the algorithm guides people through the process, but they have their autonomy in place to be able to choose how far they want to go, how long they want to go, whether they want to remain anonymous or whether they want to create an account to enhance their experience or not. It's totally private. We don't collect information other than just helping people guide through the through the platform.
So it sounds like it's like a more of a self-service kind of thing, where I guess you're helping them to be more introspective. But when does the touch point of like connecting them to either a counselor or someone to guide them happen? Or is that usually like you wait for them to be comfortable to like reach out?
Well, one of the things is we realized the challenge of scaling. So there's about 2.6 million unexpected pregnancies in the US every year. We identified that about 87% of those people don't talk to anybody or don't want to talk to anybody. So that's really our target, is the 87%. And so that's roughly, a little over 2.2, 2.4 million people out there. So in order to scale for that audience, we realized that we could never, A, these folks don't want to talk to anybody. B, they're never going to walk into any sort of counseling center or any sort of traditional service provider. And so we wanted to create a platform that was totally self-directed. Uh, and then also, ultimately, we know that they do need to be connected back into community, but the community that they need, oftentimes they already possess. Again, about 4 years ago, we did a very quantitative, qualitative research into the experience of abortion by people who had experienced it, both male and female. And what we saw is that when people experience an unexpected pregnancy, they change their circle of trust. And so, even though they have oftentimes people that could help them or that care for them, they isolate from those people. And so, our ultimate goal is not for us to be the solution to their problem. Our ultimate goal is to equip them to be able to go to the resources they already have and be able to capitalize on those for their resilience and future. And yeah, I mean, that's That's ultimately the scalability, is that we want people connected to their own communities. Now, we want to also develop national partnerships with other organizations who could offer and provide help and support and aid and those kind of things. And we're actively engaged in that project as well to be able to offer that service. Also, because so many of our in-person appointments here in New York City are virtual appointments or Zoom appointments, we have capacity eventually to link those that are most in need to somebody who could actually help them.
How do people find out about you guys?
Marketing, that's a big part of what we're doing. It's a startup, so we have a big marketing budget in order to understand what's the SEO that people are using to search for these issues. Who are those people? How do they connect with the personas that we've identified from our own research? And then, so yeah, we develop ad campaigns based on what people are searching for and need. For example, we know men oftentimes search for, she's pregnant, I don't want it. And so that's one of our ad campaigns, is around the idea of what happens when as a guy, you find out your girlfriend's pregnant and your initial response is, I don't want it. And so that ad campaign directs them to a landing page where they're able to go through one of these tiled sessions of identifying their own emotions. And then how do you talk to your girlfriend about your emotions? How do you both express, how do you not process necessarily in the raw with her, but how do you find ways to think through this issue so that when you do speak with her, you're in a much better headspace?
Is this specifically for Christians or is it just anybody?
No, it's not, it's for everybody.
It's for everybody.
And yeah, I mean, we are coming from a faith perspective. We are not amoral about the issues, but the way we think about it is that we're not acting moralistically,
Mm.
that we want to respect people's agency, but also provide the appropriate tools that they willingly actively can use to make decisions that their future selves will be happy with.
Mm.
Because again, we know, again, we started with research. Everything is driven by research. No one in our experience saw abortion as a positive thing. It was often the end result of a lot of unresolved dilemmas. And so we identified that if we could help people in the process to resolve those dilemmas, to figure out pathways through them, they inevitably ended up making choices, you know, that were healthier, that were better, that were more wholesome and life giving for everybody involved.
Could you give me some examples of what those dilemmas would be and how
Sure,
it shapes their decisions?
sure. Someone's in college and they think they can't graduate if they have a child. And so we provide ways of thinking through that. Like, here's how you could talk. This is sort of more in person at the moment, but we're actually developing on our online platform a partnership with an organization that works with women in college. And so one of the things is like, how do you talk to your, student affairs office about special, you know, cases for being pregnant in school? How do you work with your professors to solve, maybe your due date and your finals are the same week? There are a lot of those kind of practical ways. The other thing is like, well, how do I apply for childcare support? How do I find resources? A lot of those, questions are out there, but buried in a lot of other information. So we become sort of a one-stop shop for somebody facing that particular dilemma. Um, Another dilemma is oftentimes, interestingly, faith communities. Faith communities can actually force people to feel a lot more shame about being pregnant. And so it actually isolates people from the people who could actually provide support for them. And so one of the things is, how do I talk to maybe my parents or my faith community about being pregnant? What can I expect? How do I identify safe people to be my advocates? How do I navigate this process of dealing with shame and guilt and coming to a place of forgiveness and acceptance?
Do you guys reach out to churches to try to partner with them as part of your marketing campaign, or is it always just like,
No, I mean, again, our audience, I mean, we're not opposed to that, but it's not our primary strategy. Our primary
hmm,
strategy is the people facing these issues. And so we just haven't, there's a partner organization we do work with called Pro Grace, and their whole mission is equipping churches how to welcome and understand the issues of pregnancy and abortion for folks in the church. And so that's their lane, and we love them, and we think what they do is great. But we just have a slightly different lane.
so you've been a pastor for a really long time too, and I saw you went to
Yeah,
Westman, so
yeah,
you're like my alumni. Um, and you mentioned like with church, it's tricky because there is a moral aspect to it, and the Bible's really clear about life. However, you were talking about not being moralistic about this issue. So, how do you think churches can better approach this sensitive topic with people to create that,
yeah,
space for grace where the people going through it, they don't feel more shameful than they do.
yeah. I mean, what's interesting, Danny, is that oftentimes the church camps out on issues that people already know. Like um, I'm pregnant. You know, hey, yeah, I knew that probably wasn't wise decisions that I was making, and they're already self-judging. You know, what they need is help and support and encouragement. And they feel like the church is not going to give it to them.
Mm.
And so that's one of the reasons they isolate from the church, is they're like, I'm just going to hear more of that internal critic from people around me. The other thing is like, um, people know this is a child, like there's no questions. And yet a lot of the pro life movement has spent a lot of money and effort and ink on this is a baby. Well, everybody knows it's a baby. It's not a Nobody gives birth to a lawn chair. They know what it is. They know where it came from. They know how it got there. And so the question is oftentimes deeper than that issue. Like, okay, what they need is the support of like, yeah, okay, this is life. Life is complex. You made a mistake. You probably already know you made a mistake. How do we move forward from here? What's the pathway? How does the gospel equip us to deal with our own self-shame over sin? I mean, we're all in the same boat. We confess our sin every week. So how do I process, you know, this that's a more public thing than you or the rest of the church who's dealing with similar issues that just are able to be more hidden easily?
Mm.
And so, how do we recognize we're a community of people who step out of line, and yet God is still gracious and kind to us? He doesn't give us what we deserve. Instead, He gives us grace and empowers us by the Spirit to make better decisions for our future.
But the pushback is how much grace is too much grace. It's always that in the back of people's
Well,
minds.
I mean, theologically, the question is, how gracious is God?
Mm.
Is He gracious 80%, or is He gracious all the way through?
I mean, I'm actually like recently switched camps on this issue of being gracious because I've already seen it like in real life in my relationship with other people where I've given them way more grace than I would in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a funny thing where a softer touch over the course of like decades it compounds to a better relationship. And yeah, people still make the same mistakes, but sometimes, and looking at my own life, I can't even stop myself sometimes, when you're in the moment. But yeah, when God finally changes your mind and your heart, you realize the people who are the most gracious to you, those are the people that I tend to run back toward, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a fundamentally a view of what produces change.
Mm-hmm.
Are people changed by sort of finger pointing? And I don't think so. I think people are changed by like what you're talking about. The people who've shown me grace, who have been kind, who I knew I screwed up, and yet they knew I screwed up, and yet they still treated me with compassion, even when they had to say challenging things to me. I mean, I think the gospel combines things that oftentimes we think are uncombinable, like truth and grace. Like we tend to pit truth against grace instead of understanding it is truth and grace welded together. They, that's what produces change. It's like, hey, I'm not ignoring the situation. I'm not ignoring or pretending, you know, but um, I'm not ever going to abandon or leave you. I mean, again, you hear echoes of scripture here. I'm never leave you or forsake you. And so that's the hard, we would call kind of the third way approach of a lot oftentimes sort of on any issue, we can get caught up in the ditch on the right or the ditch on the left and think the only option is switching camps from a ditch on one side to a ditch on the other side when there's like a 6-lane highway in between. Sometimes we just need to switch lanes.
Yeah.
We don't need to drive into a ditch. And so with people on sort of these issues of like pregnancy or abortion, to realize like, okay, the Bible is clear, people's conscience is clear, people know these things. I don't have to camp out on it. I can say, hey, how do I help here in the middle? How do I help this process so that you make good decisions, so that you make wiser future decisions, so that this thing that happened, you're able to learn from, grow from, and move into a healthier space in the future. And how do you help other people with this? How do you encourage people going through the same thing you're going through?
How did you come to faith in Christ, and how did you come from your pastoral experience to what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I became a Christian. Well, I grew up in the South in the 70s. And so there's, as Flannery O'Connor says, the South is Christ haunted. There's you can't avoid issues of faith, and we went to church regularly as a family and all that. But I don't think I had it sort of a turning point in my faith was in high school where I realized, hey, I can't shake sin. It just keeps, it keeps getting at me. And no matter how much self-effort I put into it, it's not going to change. And so that really brought me to the place of I need some help. And I was in a gracious relationship with a youth pastor who, in a small group Bible study, was just consistently pointing every issue back to the person and work of Jesus, and began to see, man, this is a compelling figure. He is different and profoundly gracious. And so it was in the context of that small group Bible study, I placed my faith in Christ, began to walk as a Christian, try to align my life to Christian values. And
How old were you?
15, 16,
Okay.
right in there. Then went to college, had great Christian community, did a couple of summer projects in different places, and then after college came on staff with a Christian ministry full time, which brought me to New York City in the late 80s, working in inner city ministry. And, that was really eye opening too. Christian ministries that what was success and what was not success. And is oftentimes, you know, not what was touted wasn't always what was actual um, for ministries in places of poverty, and began to see there was a need for this kind of third way approach, on,
Could you give me an example?
well, uh, there's what sort of what I used to call, drive by, ministries that would pop up at Christmas, give away a lot of gifts, claim a lot of success, and then they're gone in February, and the neighborhood's not changed at all. You know? And yet, there were also, on the flip side, sort of lots of little mom and pop ministries that were faithfully present, doing all kinds of stuff that was far more effective, and yet got far less praise or, notoriety for those things. And so began to realize, like, oh, what's really what's behind the story is most important. And so, um, yeah, so started. We were part of Redeemer as it first got started, and so that was really transformative. Seeing what we felt like at the time was a church that really embodied a gospel stance of this third way, neither sort of right wing or left wing, but tried to hold truth and love together in a fresh way, which then led me to go to Westminster. I started, they were offering extension courses at the time. And so I started, taking Greek and introduction to ministry and those kind of things here in the city while we were working in Washington Heights, and then ended up matriculating to Westminster, graduating, then sort of a typical church journey. I went on staff at a church for 3 years in Atlanta, and then moved to Salt Lake City and planted a church there for 16 years, and then came back here to New York in 2016 to help on the executive team at Redeemer as Tim Keller was stepping down, and helped sort of remanage how we were going to divvy up the congregations and ministries in ways that made sense. Then I went to Dallas for a few years in pastoral ministry, but was really thinking through, like, what's next. I felt like I'd kind of come to the end of my pastoral phase of ministry. And then that's when Avail reached out to me to come on to help with building this platform. And so, yeah, I've enjoyed that work. A lot of it is, I wasn't necessarily a marketing expert or IT expert, but I've learned a lot in the last 2 years. And, what I feel like I do well is manage people and listen and sort of keep the user journey at the center of what we're doing, which is, I think, helped guide me through this transition.
Um, what was your time at Westminster like? Because I think you are like maybe the last class with Pete Enns and the whole turnover, right? Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I was there, what I would call kind of the golden age of
Yeah,
Westminster.
that's what everyone says.
Uh, again, it kind of keeps going back to the same thing I keep talking about. This Claire Davis was a professor at Westminster, and Claire used to say all of church history is really a pendulum swing between extremes.
Mm.
And it's these kind of truth and grace. You kind of swing from one extreme to the other, and you sort of have truth driven phases of church history where it's very dogmatic and very doctrinal. And you have very grace driven periods of time where it's very, everything's okay and it's all flowers and butterflies. Um, but that's Claire's really the source of this idea of, like, the third way for me. Like, how do you, but the power of the church is always when those two are combined, when there's truth and love, when the church is clear about its moral direction and its moral convictions, but it's also incredibly gracious and outwardly facing at the same time. And so, um, all that to say, I feel like I was at a time at Westminster that was like, that pendulum in the middle, where I saw the truth and the doctrinal side, but I also saw a lot of grace and outreach and mercy and missional vision. Um, at at the same time. And a lot of ways it helped make sense of my Redeemer experience in the early 90s of like, okay, Tim's great, but he's just borrowing from, Kuiper here, or he's just, stealing from, you know, Lloyd Jones, or, like, oh, in fact, Lloyd Jones actually preached the sermon I just heard Tim talk about last week, those kind of things. So it was helpful to sort of see the Redeemer experience wasn't a one off. It was really connected to a thread line through the church's history of times when the church, regardless of its tradition, had really embraced both truthfulness and love as its dual calling.
Where in Atlanta were you? Because I was there for 2 years actually. I just came back.
Yeah, I was at a church called Christ Church in Buckhead for three
It's in Buckhead.
years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were you the senior pastor there, or?
No, I was right out of seminary needing a job, so I was just their first assistant
Oh,
pastor hire.
nice. Okay.
Yeah.
And then you were in Utah for Salt Lake for 16 years.
Yeah, I moved to Salt Lake in 2000 and we left in 2016. So I say church planting, but it was really a replant. The church had started, the original planter had had a moral failure. The church was really in disarray, about to close. And so I moved there, green and unwiseness, at the time. But nonetheless, moved there in 2000 and yeah, saw a turnaround and a church that moved to healthiness. And so we left in 2016. My wife and I were both 50 and felt like it was at the end of one chapter.
I have two questions about that. One, what was it like turning around a church? And I guess how big was it? And then two, what is church like in Salt Lake when Mormons are very prominent?
Yeah, I mean, a church turnaround is the worst of all possible worlds. There's no money and all problems. And so um, it's really only by God's grace that it happened.
Hmm.
But it's replanting a church is like performing a wedding and a funeral at the same time
That's
because there's people are coming. They're like, "Hey, it's a wedding, it's a party. Let's get excited and move on." And then there are other people who are like, "No, we've got this dead body in the back. We've got to grieve." And so there's always these two groups of people in the first 3 to 5 years of that project. And the funeral always wins, unless you really do a good job of laying to rest the old, you can't move forward to the future. And so I didn't know that at the time, so it probably took a lot longer. But it it took having to sort of honor the past and recognize what God had done in the past, and not just pretend it hadn't happened, even the bad parts, and be able to grieve it before we could move on. But I
oh, I
think
love.
in the early days, I tried to move on too quickly. I tried to, let's just talk about the party, and it made people who needed to grieve mad.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, that was the first 3 to 5 years was a lot of wedding funeral stuff. Then after that period of time, it was like, okay, this is who we are. How do we live missionally in a context that is says a lot of Christian things, but may not be quite as Christian as it seems to be on the surface. And so this got into like, how do we talk about our faith in ways that connect to the heart and don't get sidelined by um, grammatical issues? And so it was very much a missional experience of like, how do we affirm good things that are part of this culture, and how do we take a different point of view without becoming just finger pointy and angry. Again, kind of going back to similar themes of like, how do people change? People change when you recognize there is a problem and you provide an alternative solution that actually works. And so, yeah, we we began to see. I began to see my my role as a pastor in that context was just helping my church act like good missionaries. Like they were the ones that had we all did neighbors, friends, coworkers, family who believed things very differently. So how do we act as Christians, not just argue as Christians in those contexts? How do we recognize people's bruises and tend to them? Because a very moralistic culture like Salt Lake has a lot of people who fall off the back of the turnip truck. You know, they make a sharp turn. There's a lot of fruit that rolls off the back of the truck. And so our job was just kind of going around picking up bruised fruit, you know, people who were going through divorces, people who, for one reason or the other, fell off the progression bandwagon of Mormonism, you know, people whose kids weren't doing well, people who were facing same sex attraction, people who, um, you know, were not doing well economically, because Mormonism has a very clear progress track. And if you fall off that, then you're somehow spiritually damaged goods. And so, again, it's this issue of grace. How do you extend grace to people who know they're damaged, know they've fallen short, and have tried everything they can do morally, religiously to correct it and can't? And so they are hungry for relief of a savior who really genuinely loves and cares for them and who looks at them with truth and grace. And so you ask how big. We weren't huge. I mean, when I left, the church was maybe 150-ish people, which, in Salt Lake was a pretty good sized congregation.
Actually, that's a good question for you, because you've been to. I mean, you were pastoring a church of 150, and you were at Redeemer, which I'm guessing is in like maybe the thousands. Um,
Well, yeah, when I was there, 2016 was sort of the peak, was maybe 6,000 ish people between all the congregations.
yeah, so I actually read Tim Keller's article on like church dynamics, and he goes through progressions of church sizes. Um, but more and more I think about it, I personally don't think. I think there's far less benefit for a mega church than positives, and I don't know what your views are on that.
I sort of see it as an ecosystem, like in a healthy ecosystem, there's a variety of different life forms,
Mm,
that exhibit and they work together in a positive way.
mm,
And so, like in Salt Lake, there were some very large churches that grew there while we were there, and there were some medium sized and a lot of small. Now, I think that small churches struggle. They're always struggling financially. The model is difficult to replicate in this modern era, where people don't automatically give or tithe like they used to. And so it's hard to sustain a full time pastorate in a smaller church model. Um, so I think, and then in large churches, there's lots of obvious problems, anonymity, people feeling lost, not connected. But on the flip side, like in a healthy ecosystem, those can work together, where, uh, like in Salt Lake, I felt it was the most healthy church ecosystem I'd ever been a part of. And the churches knew each other because we were all kind of small. I mean, relatively to the larger culture. And so people were much more able to say, well, if we're not what you're looking for, try my friend over here or try this church. And there were periods of time where people would kind of rotate because they had different needs at the time. Like, hey, my high schooler is going through a lot of stuff and I need some specialty help with that area. Okay, well, we don't have that, but this church does. And I think when there was more of an open handedness about the people are the Lord's, the people aren't ours, then those churches can work well together.
mm. I totally agree. Maybe it's not much church size, but just a mentality of the churches of
Yeah,
being more
attitude is, yeah, definitely, Danny. Attitude is everything. You know, and there's a lot of places where every church is trying to be a cathedral. It just doesn't work. You know, there's a need for parishes and there's a need for cathedrals. Like, you know, a 150 size congregation can't put on an orchestra and a Christmas pageant, da da da, at the same way a 3,000 member congregation can. There's no shame in that. It just is the fact. And they different strokes for different folks. Different congregations attract different kinds of people.
Yeah, but my mentality is more like a Uno reverse because if someone says, "Oh yeah, they have an orchestra," it's like, but why do we need it? I mean, once in a while, great, but like every week, because the other side of it is like you mentioned, like there's a higher operating cost for bigger churches,
Mm-hmm.
right? And when I think about like, and this isn't just churches, it's just like Ivy League schools and their endowments where they have like $60 billion just sitting, on cash. It's mind-boggling to me that there's just so much money stored yet not being utilized because people are like trying to preserve something in the future. And even for churches, like I don't know what the budgets are, but like yeah, I used to work at a big church and we're spending a lot of money on things and a lot of times they don't even like itemize everything. It's just like a general estimate of like this is how much we're spending, and I'm like mind boggled.
Mm.
When yeah, when like specific needs for like people, the budget's a lot smaller. So I don't know. That's something I still struggle with. Of
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like the Book of Proverbs, right? Like, don't give me too much or don't give me too little. Help me to have just enough. And uh, most of my church experience has been the Lord is always faithful, but He's never early, and He's never overly abundant in His provision. It's always exactly what I need. So other people may have different experiences, but
my joke is he always gets more than enough, but the more than enough is like a penny more or a dollar more. It's like okay. Um, so what made you kind of transition out of pastoral ministry? Because that kind of happened
yeah,
to me too.
I think a lot of factors. One is I think just personally, I was ready for a different challenge. Second of all, I think that the nature of the church currently has gotten extremely hard to manage. Sort of the political, cultural environment is putting pastors in a no-win situation that, no matter what you do, no matter how much you say one thing or the other, it is hard to stay a third way leader in a right ditch, left ditch world. And so, there's certainly some of that. Um, Third, I think just I was wanting a place where I could be a little more innovative and try some new strategies because I was seeing sort of a radical shift in the nature of people we were trying to reach. I often joke that I'm a perfectly attuned pastor for the 1990s. Like, if you could just can me up and send me back to the 1990s, I'd be awesome.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, that was my childhood, so I totally get you.
So I think I just feel like there were some age and stage issues. There were some desires to have a different challenge for the next last phase of third phase of my career. And there is, I think there is a missional challenge was behind it all. That the world really is fundamentally changing, and there needs to be some creative innovation on thinking about what does it look like to reach and genuinely care for and show people a gospel approach to life. that we haven't tried before.
So, what advice would you give to pastors who feel like, I went to seminary, I went to Bible school, this is
Yeah.
the only thing I know, and they're maybe like gun shy, maybe leaving the pastorate to go to another like industry?
Yeah, don't feel that you're not pigeonholed. I think people in the church have this strange way of shackling the pastor by saying you're doing God's will by being our pastor, and oftentimes that's a way of keeping them from actually considering the call to something else. I mean, I would have people, as a pastor would come to me and say, we're going to another church. And it would always hurt, like, what did we do wrong? But over time, you're going to realize, like, the Spirit blows where it wills. I can't control people, it's not my job. I can bless them. And so the more I could bless people and help them feel like they were sent and they were encouraged, the more those relationships developed over time, the more people would come back, and the thing they thought was the shiny, glittering goal didn't turn out. They're like, oh, well, we should just go back to where we were loved and cared for. And they showed us we were loved and cared for by how we left. So I kind of think that with ministry, like it's not a life sentence. It is God calls people into the pastorate and he calls people out of it. There's no shame in that. What else would I say? I think pastors are under recognized, and all Christian ministry folks are under recognized in the skills that they develop that are transferable to business or all kinds of other fields. They have to deal with competing demands. They understand how to do a lot with a very little bit of budget. Generally, they're often very good at communication and speaking and taking complex ideas and making them understandable to everyday folks. They're good at collaboration. They're good at creative thinking. They're good at all kinds of things that, the modern marketplace demands. Like you can have any sort of degree, and I can tell you in 3 years, it's going to be a totally different field than what you started. And so you've got to be able to be swift on your feet to think about implications. And so I think ministry folks do a very good job at that. And I wish more folks in the marketplace understood that and were willing to give them off ramps from ministry.
Yeah, I mean, primarily me asking you is like I already have people in my mind that are pastors, and talking to them, it's been like COVID's been really difficult, and just transitioning out of that. But they're all feel stuck because this is all they know, and like for me, like yeah, I've worked before seminary. I went to seminary. I worked at church. I thought I was going to do that all my life. Then I got into coding, and like all these steps along the way, I was always put in a position to do something brand new, and it was hard.
Mhm.
But that's normal. Like I want people to know,
Right.
like when you go into anything brand new, it's normal. But the fact that like you can bank on your experiences, because at the end of the day we're just dealing with people, right? It's always
Correct.
problems with people. So like even with you, talking to you, I just get this overwhelming pastoral sense. And so even though you're trying to figure out your job, I probably no doubt people who work with you probably love you to death because you're so gracious. And that's so important. And like you said, it's about establishing trust in the beginning, and then people will always give that grace back to you,
Right.
give you the benefit of the doubt of working through and learning.
Yeah, I mean, one practical thing I would, like you said, you sort of took a coding class, so you knew how to code. I mean, do something if you're a pastor out there and looking, or ministry for folks and looking to make a transition. Go get a certification in something, that interests you. Maybe you design, maybe user experience, and maybe coding. It could be all kinds, but something that's really super practical that people are actually looking for help to do. And then parlay that into, who do you know that needs this kind of thing, and just start networking. You're experts at networking. So turn on that skill set.
Very minimum, people should just blog. and write a book, and then it'll help bring that exposure of what you know, and then people will find you. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, writing or blogging or, podcasting is a great way of just refining your
Mhm.
voice. What is it that I say? What are the topics that I keep coming back to?
Mm. I have some fun questions I'm going to
Yep.
ask you now. What was your best childhood memory?
Oh, my best childhood memory is I had an art teacher named Linnell Widener. So every Thursday afternoon, I went to a group of us to her house, and she taught us art. And just that time of doing something with my hands creatively was the best part of my childhood.
How often did you go?
Every week, from about second grade through junior high school.
And what made you give up art?
I didn't give it up. I just it sort of went underground, but that's one of those things that's come back for me. In fact, I have an Instagram account called More Than Cardboard that I take cardboard and I do projects on, and then I release it like street art. And so you can follow me on Instagram at More Than Cardboard.
Nice. We'll put that in the description. You could be the next
Yeah.
Banksy with cardboard. Let's see. What's one prayer request you would want answered instantly?
Instantly.
Yeah.
My wife's a nurse and she's looking for a new job, and it would
Mm.
be great if she could get a day job that is less stressful than working in a hospital.
Mm. What like is her specialty or?
She's been labor and delivery, uh, high risk obstetrics, that kind of thing.
Mm. Okay. What are you hoping for at Faithly?
Yeah, it's interesting in this era of trying to create communities, right? Like you're building a community and then seeking then to empower those people within the community to do or to thrive or to grow. And so it's interesting. I'm just curious about how this community could be used to help break down some walls between um, previously segregated parts of the church into maybe new avenues of collaboration and cooperation and innovation.
Mm. And how could we be praying for you and your family?
Yeah, I mean, you could pray for just our health and we're my wife and I make these kind of 15-year plans, and we're at the start of this kind of probably last 15-year, plan. Maybe there's two more left, but definitely within 30 years I'll be dead. So, the next 15 years of like, how do we both sort of wrap up and empower younger leaders in this phase of life is really my vision for how to listen to and care for and tend to and support and encourage those younger leaders who are going to be taking over. I feel like I'm a Generation X, so I'm between boomers and millennials, which are the two mountain peaks. And so I'm always, my whole life, my whole career has been translating between these two groups of people. And now boomers are slowly exiting the stage, but I'm trying to like, what do the Z's and the next generation look like, and how can I be a good mentor and citizen to them in that emerging generation?
Mm. All right. Well, this was great.
Yeah,
So
thanks.
encouraging talking to you. Like your voice is just very pastoral. Like,
Well,
yeah.
thanks, Danny. Appreciate it.
Well, that's it for the podcast, guys. Bye.